what I'm going to talk about is how we make trials as informative and useful and relevant as they can possibly be. Pre-funding. In other words, we give our trials the best possible chance of providing relevant and useful information. And I'm going to start with a conclusion. And the conclusion is loads of trials are rubbish. That's depressing, as we heard earlier. So many of you will have heard of a British statistician, Doug Altman, now sadly dead. But in 1994, he wrote a paper called The Scandal of Poor Medical Research. And the only regret that Doug had about that article was that he used the word poor and not bad. So years later, some colleagues and I thought we would correct that and look at the sorts of issues that Doug was raising, and we would use the word bad. And we did, and this is one of our conclusions. Most randomized trials are bad. I'll tell you what that means in a moment. We got some constructive criticism on that. It was friendly, it was useful, and we engaged with that. And together with Francis Sheely, we looked at some of the trials that we were looking at here again, and we did some reassessments. And what we found there was loads of trials are bad, but a few more are good. And that was because some of those which were uncertain, we were unclear, we thought there were more of those which were actually good. But even that percentage there means that about 80% of the trials in this sample of about 150 are either bad or possibly bad. So this is still, it's better, not great. Okay, how did we do this? How did we come to this conclusion? We looked at Cochrane systematic reviews, and we extracted the two most recent reviews across all of the clinical groups that Cochrane looks after, which is loads. And then within those reviews, we extracted information on every single included trial, and we looked at the risk of bias, because this had been assessed by the review authors. And we came up with three categories. If the review authors say that this is a high risk of bias trial, we have reasons to be wary of the results, then we would call that bad, thinking of Doug's word. If we had no doubts, it was low risk of bias, we would call that good. And if it was in the middle, we were uncertain, it was uncertain, we would call it uncertain, except for the purposes of talks where we call it ugly, because then that allows us to do this, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we see here in the middle, Lee Van Cleef, the bad. 62% of all the trials in that cohort came out as high risk of bias. And poor old Clint Eastwood, 8% of the trials in that cohort came out as low risk of bias. And then a whole bunch over there where there was uncertainty. So that attracted the attention of the Gates Foundation. So they saw that article, and then they approached me, and we started a discussion. And the reason we started a discussion is because the Gates Foundation was worried that it was funding trials that were going to be uninformative. They were going to produce results which were not relevant, were not useful, were flawed in some way. And they had a very strong sense in their bones that they were doing that. They were putting a lot of money into trials that would go on to be uninformative. And clearly, they're interested in ways of avoiding that. They were also concerned about the money they gave to other funders, and those funders did not have processes in place to make it as highly likely as possible that trials they fund using Gates Foundation money would be informative. So we then spoke for about a year. It was an interesting experience. Quite like the Gates Foundation, but they're completely unlike any other funder I've worked with. But quite like the discussions. This is what we ended up framing all of our work around, something called the informativeness framework. I had not heard of this before talking to the Gates Foundation. It is, however, quite sensible, and it taps into things that in the UK we might call efficiency in trials, but it's things like the importance of the research question, how you put together your design, feasibility, etc. There's nothing shocking in the informativeness framework. For the Gates Foundation, it was very important that we did not talk about efficiency for reasons which we could talk about later. But this was fine. So we framed it all around informativeness, and I like this. I don't have any problems with it at all. What did we propose to do? Together with the Gates Foundation, so this is why they're very different to any other funder, they and I together came up with a plan. They're very invested in what we produce. So first bit, we're going to look at the literature, have looked at the literature. What have others done or said about ways to improve the likely chance of informativeness? We also looked at a content analysis. What do organizations like funders and ethics bodies say to applicants about what they are looking for in the submissions you make? We also wanted to talk to people around the world in different roles to get their ideas. What do you think could be done, pre-funding award, to make a trial more likely to be informative? And then there's some mapping we're going to do, and then we'll do a toolkit or a pile of stuff to make all of this available. So I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm going to talk about the review, the interview study, and then some of the mapping. And this is still ongoing. So this project is not due to finish until next July. So it's still ongoing, but I'll give you some pointers as to where we're headed. The review is published. So if you wanted to look at this, there it is. Hopefully you'll get the slides and you can go and have a look at that review. So this looked across a lot of the literature. Awful lot of the literature that was identified in this review comes from the UK, Ireland, and the States. It's very heavy around those countries. And I'm going to show you something which we were not looking for, but came up in this review. So we were not looking for this, but it came up, and it was to do with tools. So one of the things that we found in the literature was a lot of reference to the idea of using tools that exist to support the trial funding process. So we've heard about earlier on today, core outcome sets. That came up in this literature review as a tool that could be used in a trial funding process. Spirit, the trial protocol reporting standard, came up in this review as a tool that could help the trial or a trial's chance of being informative if that Spirit tool was used in the funding process. But the most used tool, or most referenced tool, somewhat embarrassingly, was Précis 2, because I've been involved in that development. But it was one of the tools that, again, people were suggesting this could be used in the process of putting together a trial proposal, which then goes to a funder. So the active use of tools to support the likely chance of a trial being informative. So that list of tools plus some list of best actions are in that review. So you could have a look at that if you wanted to. Now, I'm not talking about the content analysis, but I will say a little bit about the interview study. So we wanted this to be global. We didn't want to talk to people who were all based in the UK. The Gates Foundation specifically said to me, we do not want the British Mafia. In those words, do not want the British Mafia. So we had there's a contractual limit on the number of UK people I could speak to in this project. As I said, they're a different funder to other funders. I quite like working with them. So we looked globally. They were interested in Global South because Gates Foundation funds a lot of trials in the Global South, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. So we wanted to look across roles. So we had a lot of investigators. Investigators wear many hats. So some of these individuals were giving not only a researcher perspective, but an ethics perspective and a funder perspective, sometimes regulatory as well. And then other perspectives where people were really speaking with one perspective alone. So we did reasonably well getting a range of perspectives, and countries we did reasonably well. We were below our Gates Foundation worry. We did not want the UK to dominate, and it doesn't. But the UK and the USA together are a big part of our constituency. And because of the funder, the USA came out as just the biggest of our contributors. But it's a reasonable spread. And some of these countries, like Kenya, for example, the Gates Foundation were interested specifically in us getting ideas from Kenya. So the funder led some of our decision making. But we've got a nice mix of countries involved. Now, we spoke to 55 people. Those 55 people said lots of things. So I'm not going to have lots and lots of quotes, but I've just got two. So this one, which came from an investigator in Ethiopia, mentioned something about being pragmatic. And I think here, this individual is thinking about pragmatic probably in the more operationalized sense. We heard this morning, we're good at complexity. I think this person is saying we ought to think carefully about how complex we make our trials, take a view which is closer to perhaps this idea of we should design a trial which looks closer to the sort of place we would want those results to be used. But pragmatic came up in other comments too. So it was mentioned explicitly by some of the people we interviewed. And then this one I wanted to flag, because it allows me to point to this project down there. But it was really about thinking through how we, I guess, increase trust in research and trials in particular, and that this is an issue in and of itself, and particularly as this person is talking about, particularly groups who have traditionally been underserved, that this lack of trust is likely to be a very, very important factor for why it is sometimes difficult to effectively engage with groups of individuals who have historically been underserved. So that came through, and it came through not just in the interviews, but in other places too. So what did we find? We found that lots of the same things came up across these three strands of data. And the bit in the orange is basically saying there were loads of best practice options and actions and agent suggestions rather that came out of all of them. What we do not want to do, though, is produce something which says, here are the 52 best practice actions for you. We wanted to try and compress that into something which was more palatable and which people could engage with more usefully. So can we collapse some of this? And of course, there is quite a bit of overlap, as you said. So, we might talk about that later. Ask me a question if you're interested in what that means. So it's complicated, but we, and particularly Sarah Prowse, my colleague, we've pretty much think there are 12 headline issues from this. It might end up being 11 or 10. Increasingly, I'm thinking it will actually stay at the 12 that I'm going to show you right now. And that these fall into three groups: design, conduct, and knowledge transfer, knowledge mobilization. Okay, so let's just go through them. The orange ones being the headline message. These are the, I guess, people who have something to think about. So the point being made here has something to do with these people. That's what that's sort of pointing at. So let's go through them one by one. So the first one, this came through really strongly across all three strands. If you want a trial to be as informative, or likely to be as informative as it can be, there needs to be some rationale, a priority at the start of your piece of work that says, this is why we need this trial. Here is the evidence that says that there is a gap, an important question, an unmet need, and here is the gap in the evidence that demonstrates that we need another trial. Without that, some explicit rationale or a formal prioritization process that says this is an unmet need within research, you have a better chance of doing a rubbish trial. Guess that's what the message is there. Explicit requirements from funders to say, what is the rationale, leaning on preferably systematic review evidence that this trial is needed. The next one, we've heard this multiple times. It's great to have heard it multiple times because it came out of these three strands. Engage patients and communities early. So right at the beginning of the design stage, talk to them. build their thoughts into the design process. And that came out as one of the ways of reducing the chances of a poor trial. Design tools, I've already talked about that. Things like Comet was mentioned. Things like Spirit was mentioned. Prayson 2 was mentioned. This one, what that basically means here, the way I'm interpreting this, is on your grant, the funder should be saying, and who is the statistician with years of experience who is going to guarantee your analysis and sample size calculations, like all the analysis? Who is that person? What is their experience and background? And if you don't have a person, your proposal is dead. That's the message from that. You really, really need the appropriate people in your team, and especially statisticians. Without that, you're on a very sticky wicket. This pre-funding scientific assessment came out. I think that's a bit tricky, potentially. So you'd have peer review. There'll be the panel, generally a panel, the funder will discuss it. What this is suggesting is, and another one, another review, really thinking about protocols. So we're trying to think of a way of getting the spirit of that without suggesting a third assessment process or a full-on third assessment process. But it did come out as a finding. Quality by design means making sure there are things in your design which are very focused on things that have an awful lot to say about the likely chances of an informative trial. Well, one example of this would be, how are you doing your randomization? Things which are absolutely critical to whether your trial will produce results which are trustworthy, we can have some confidence in. If we move on to conduct, let's pick out a couple of these. Feasibility came out strongly in interviews, a bit less elsewhere. But one of the problems that people flagged was there's not enough attention on the nitty-gritty of how are we confident that we can deliver this trial, that we can engage these participants, we can keep those participants in the trial, and specifically emphasize the need to talk to people with lived experience of the condition and hear what their views are. And let's talk about this one, oversight. Are there organizations or groups of people who can hold your feet to the fire? Why are you doing this? What's happening there? Will things be done according to the protocol? Are you diverging? So oversight committees, pretty common in many big UK trials, certainly. And then this is the last of the findings that's just mentioned. Oh, these can mention quite quickly. Registration, register the trial, easy. Force people to register their trial. That's what that's saying. And then this one is making the findings available in an accessible format. And as Derek mentioned in one of the workshops yesterday, in the UK, feeding results for drug trials back to participants will from next April be a legal requirement in the UK, which fits in very nicely to what we have found from these three strands of work. It's one of the things that will help. So to conclude, our very first interviewee said, we know how to make trials more informative. Actually, it isn't a mystery. None of these things are rocket science. They're all there and have been for a long time. What we hope we'll be able to contribute to is an easier way of ensuring that more, preferably all, of these sorts of things are built into the funding process. We're particularly focused on funders. And I want to just flag this one. It means talking to people who are like the people we need to include in our trial. And we need to talk to them right at the beginning and throughout the trial to make sure that we are designing a trial that is informative and is feasible. Because without that feasibility, it will not be informative. It will fall on its face. And that is it. Thank you very much.